Namaskar, Jai Hind, and welcome to Dev Talks. Last time I did a show with Miss Maria Beat, who's here with me, about the situation in Europe and, of course, focusing on the war in Ukraine. A lot of you told me that her views were very clear cut and precise and wanted to hear her again. So here I have her with me once again, talking about the war in Ukraine and the fallout. Thank you, Maria, for joining me. I think it's great that we can actually speak overseas. You're in Istanbul right now. Turkey's gone through complete hell, and I hope you're safe and sound at this moment when we speak.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Aadi. You're absolutely correct. It's a very demanding time for Turkey these days. And I hope that we will manage through successfully and we won't have any devastating earthquakes coming shortly. Because what happened the other day was really something major. Turkey has not experienced this kind of earthquakes since 1939. So, well, not a good time.
Indeed, it is. I think India has pitched in its effort. The one aircraft left with relief towards Turkey in the morning, and the second one, I just got an update for Syria. Both Indian Air Force aircraft with our disaster relief teams have already are on the way, and I hope things are humanitarianly managed.
I hope so too, because everybody needs a lot of help. Yeah.
Let's begin with the military position of the war. I'd like to ask you, with regards to what's happening in your opinion. The last time we spoke, Solidar had just fallen. The Battle of Bakhmut is long and bloody. Prigozhin, who's the leader of the Wagner, said it's just about to happen. And of course, people talk about the Zaporozhye front. How do you look at it?
Well, I would say the situation in Ukraine gets from bad to worse. I can't say that Russians are making a really decisive advances. Yes, Solidar was taken, and it's considered to be a strong defense position of Ukraine. That's why Russians were saying a lot of things about taking Solidar. At first, they also said that Bakhmut, close to Solidar, another strong point of Ukrainian defense was taken. But then they said, no, 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 we're just in the process of taking it. And for nearly 2 weeks, they're still in the process. They claim major advances, major successes, that Ukraine suffers heavy casualties because they defend Bakhmut ferociously. And the reason why the Ukrainian army is doing that, because it's the so-called first line of defense. If Russians take Bakhmut within fully take Bakhmut within the next couple of days, then the way to advance further on direction of Slaviansk and Kramatorsk would be open for them, since the second line of defense over there is not completed yet by Ukrainians. So that's why the Ukrainian army fights so ferociously. But in general, this much spoken about major Russian offensive operation has not started. Some people say that they're waiting for the anniversary for February 24. Others are saying that the military reserves are not in place. But of course, nobody knows for sure. But everybody, based on the Russian side and Ukrainian side, keep waiting. That's the thing.
Interesting. Also, I want to ask you, offline, we were just before the interview started, we were talking about what's happening within Ukraine. Uh, we saw very homogenized front. It was like a fist and they were all together. But today we see Ukraine kind of withering from within. It's kind of splitting in different directions. People aren't happy because of the forced conscription. The ministers are getting caught. There's opposition to Zelensky. Does it look like a house of cards now starting to crumble?
Well, when the country is at war, all kind of frictions within the ruling elite are possible. And this is what we're having right now in Ukraine, I think, because we have to admit that Zelensky was quite successful in building his team, the team of supporters of his activities. And of course, at the very beginning, when the West rendered such a great support to Ukrainian resistance, people were enthusiastic. They were trusting Zelensky because Zelensky kept saying very soon we will overcome the Russian invasion, we will take back the Ukrainian territories to include Crimea. But now the enthusiasm fades. So people at large, and also because winter has come, people at large have become unhappy, and within his ruling elite, I think frictions are also on the rise. That's why he started purging his close circle. He fired those who were with him from the very beginning. And of course, it was a very unpleasant development when his Minister of Interior got killed in helicopter crash. Of course, it was an accident, but the Minister of Interior was one of his closest affiliates. But also, Zelensky is using this situation as an excuse for purging the former Interior Minister Avakov, because Avakov, he was never too much of Zelensky's supporters. He's an independent person enjoying a lot of authority in Ukraine, and he was extremely powerful during the previous government, the government of Poroshenko. So I would assume there is no too much love lost between Avakov and Zelensky. And in order to make a showcase that he is doing something to establish the order within his close circle, Zelensky initiated purging Avakov and also his former supporter and donor, Ukrainian oligarch Kolomoisky. So this is one thing, but I think it's largely of a showcase. Also, he has to show to the European Union that he's fighting corruption. Because I think that having pumped so much money into Ukraine, the West has started asking questions where the money is gone. Could you please account for your spending? And this is a big problem. That's why the tax authorities in Ukraine were purged and basically fired and are now under investigation. Yes, I think it would be right to say that frictions inside the so-called Zelensky house has started and the house started cracking.
It's interesting that you use that the house started cracking, because at the end of it, what we see is a complete a thought process wherein I think the Ukrainians thought it's a blank check coming from the West. Do what you want to. It's about the fight. Uh, I think it's gone completely wrong as far as the thought process is concerned. But you mentioned the Western support and the deteriorating rate of the Western support. This particular thing was brought out pretty starkly when the matter of tanks came up. Um, it was a little bit of a war of words between Germany and the rest of NATO, some of whom were very enthusiastic to send the tanks, some of whom were not. Germany, at the end of it, said, if you, to the Americans, if you send your tanks, I'll send mine. Americans said yes, then the Germans agreed. But till now, not a single tank has reached Ukraine. Also, there are now reports that Germany might not be sending their tanks. How do you
Uh,
see this as a unity factor for NATO?
well, I agree. The situation is most confusing. Last time we touched upon the matter a little bit, and I was voicing my concerns that it's not that much easy to deliver heavy armor to Ukraine. This is first thing. And also, you're right, there is no unity among the so-called Western side about sending heavy armor to Ukraine. And for a long time, the Germans were very hesitant, and uh, Chancellor Scholz kept saying, let me think about it. I'm waiting for Americans to decide on sending their Abraham tanks. And then Americans said, yes, we will send a couple of them, but we don't know when they would arrive. Now there are all kind of hearsay that nothing before spring comes could be expected. But till spring would be a very demanding time for Ukraine. And Zelensky keeps pushing the West to send him heavy armor now, right now. And I think the Brits are more flexible in terms of sending the Challenger tanks. Americans are more hesitant. A couple of days it was announced that I think it was the Netherlands who decided to send one Leopard tank to Ukraine. But up till now, they are just talking. No tanks have arrived to Ukraine. But honestly speaking, I think it's a very bad development. It's a sign of escalation, and it's a sign that Zelensky is not about to start to resort to negotiations, and this is a bad thing to happen.
Absolutely. And when you talk about escalation, I think somebody is going to send them some tanks. I'm sure Poland will be right in front and they'll be saying, take our tanks. They've been doing
Yeah.
this for a long time and they've sent their, I think, 200 of their own tanks, T-72s, into Ukraine. Keeping all that aside, you mentioned slow escalation. That's very interesting to me. Do you think this war is slowly being escalated to a point of no return, wherein this will actually expand into a larger war? Do you see the West doing that? Because, as you said, that there is no scope of any negotiation. There's no talk of any negotiation. There's no talk of a settlement. Nothing.
Well, as of now, the escalation is on the rise, and nobody wants even to think about some kind of potential settlement. What is interesting, I listened to talk show uh, organized by Ukrainian analysts to include Arestovich, the former affiliate of Zelensky and his mouthpiece until recently, and some other guys. And what they're talking about, they're saying, look, sooner or later we will have to decide what's the end, and we will have to stop. And they're talking actively about this, applying the so-called Korean scenario, when after the Korean War, the country was divided into two along the 38th parallel. And that's how we have today South Korea and North Korea. Wow, actually, this so called potential scenario was first voiced out by Americans, by William Burns, the head of CIA, some time ago. So apparently, what Arestovich is saying right now, it's not just his dream. It's something that has been generated by some knowledgeable circles. So some reasonably or cool-minded people have started to think that, look, hey, we need to stop somehow. Otherwise, this escalation would be an open-end process. And I agree with you. If it continues like that, if the West continues pumping weapons into Ukraine, then the war will never end because Russia is a resilient country. It has a lot of resources. Russians are not sitting wasting their time. They're speeding up their military production, they're training more conscripts. And if we look at Prigozhin's army, the so called Wagner PMC, they're getting stronger and stronger. and they're advancing more and more. And I believe that the Russian government contributes a lot of support and military might to their advances. So it's really has a potential nowadays to develop into a never-ending military conflict, something that the world has not experienced for centuries, I'm afraid.
It's so sad when you look when you say something like that. You lose words. Uh, but I want to stick on this low escalation a little bit because you know
Okay?
about 6 months ago when somebody said give the Ukrainians heavy weapons, 6 8 months ago the West said no, we don't want to escalate this war. We want to only give weapons to Ukraine to defend itself, right?
Right.
That thing got twisted a little bit. The HIMARS went inside, which were kind of an offensive weapon. HIMARS don't defend against anything. They're an offensive weapon. Uh, the Americans didn't send the top end ATACMS HIMARS, which would go up to about 300 kilometers and all that stuff. They sent them the lower end ones and stuff. All that okay. Tanks were unthinkable at that time. Today, tanks are being spoken about. Somebody will give tanks. If it not be Germany, if it not be American, somebody will give tanks. We know that. Now the talk is starting to, escalate onto fighter jets. Now we
Yes.
know MiG 29s have been given by Poland, Slovakia, many other countries into Ukraine. Ukraine had some 60, 70 fighters. I think they've lost more than 150 of them. I don't know how that happens. So obviously, there's some stuff which has come from outside. Now they're talking about American jets or European jets, and there are countries who would like to see this escalating. Somehow, I find the UK in that category of countries who wants to see this war escalate a little bit, who wants to damage Russia. How do you see this? Because it was no tanks today. Okay, tanks we need to send. Now it's no jets. Will this 6 months down the line be let's send some jets?
Well, the way that things develop these days, it's hypothetically possible to expect the jets coming to Ukrainian front in half a year. Well, of course, we need to keep in mind that flying F-16 jets, it's a challenge for Ukrainian fighters. But I think the NATO is training Ukrainian pilots at their bases in Europe nowadays. So in several months, they would be ready to fly F-16s, and then the Western decision on supplying Ukraine with the jets would be positive. And of course, I don't even want to think about what it could bring, because bringing armor to the battlefield, and in particular the Leopard tanks, look, the tanks with cross insignia on the armor arriving to Ukraine for Russians, it's something unbelievably unexpected because it reminds them of the Second World War fighting in Ukraine. The only difference is that at that time it was the German army who was moving the Leopard. The At that time they were called Tigers.
Tigers and the
So,
Panthers.
but still, it was German tanks that the Russians were heavily fighting against, and having German tanks in Ukraine, uh, it's something unacceptable for the Russians, and it could give a big spillover to the conflict. In regard to the so-called slow escalation, look, when the West was saying, "Oh no, we're not ready to supply to Ukraine the offensive weapons," and at that time, remember, they were talking about artillery. They were saying that Ukraine needs the anti-missile protection systems. So that's the kind of weapons we're going to provide Ukraine with. But then they started supplying Ukraine with offensive weapons, long range artillery weapons. And one of the reasons, I think, was that the economic sanctions against Russia misfired, because when they were introducing these sanctions, they were doing it simultaneously with saying, oh, only a little bit of defense or protection weapons would be sent to Ukraine. They were expecting a more positive feedback from economic sanctions. Look, remember they blew up the North Streams and they cut short Russian gas supply to Europe, and Russia for years was relying on revenues from pipeline gas sales to Europe. So they were expecting Russia to be on the verge of bankruptcy. They stopped the Russian banks' SWIFT transactions, but miraculously, Russia started doing pretty good economically, and there are some assumptions that the current economic growth indicators they even exceed the Russian expectations, because Russia was expecting its economy like 6 months ago to go down by 15 or 20%, which was compatible with expectations of the World Bank and other international agencies. And nowadays, even the international agencies say that it's only 2.5%, which is peanuts in terms of Russian economy. So the economic sanctions brought more damage to European economy, because we know that prices for fossil fuels are on the rise in Europe. Of course, Europe is not dying from frost or hunger or whatever. Europe manages, it buys LNG from America. But what's the price? Europe has to pay through the nose. And of course, it replenishes its financial abilities. So life in Europe is becoming more and more expensive for those living there, and the whole European economy now in the process of transformation. On the other hand, of course, Russia is not doing its best under sanctions. Let's be open. It's being hit pretty bad by the sanctions, but it's doing times better than it was expected initially. So the damage to Russia is not that big as the West initially predicted. So that's why the military escalation is the only means to make the Russian situation worse.
I think that's a very sound logic that you've talked about. That it's basically, in no simple words, a certain amount of frustration which is being
Yeah,
vented out through the Ukrainians, and that's sad actually, because that's
yeah,
that's how the cycle of violence kind of keeps on going up. Uh, Talking about Ukrainians, reports about the losses in Ukraine. You spoke about the purges. Uh, there are these forced conscriptions. People are being picked up off the street and thrown into battle. Uh, the situation as far as economics is terrible. And I was hearing somebody who talked about the demographics of Ukraine. A lot of people say that Ukraine was 44 million, but here is a person who's an expert in that particular region. He said it's about, at the start of the war, it was 36 million. 10 million ran away because of the war. A lot of them went to Russia, a lot of them went to the West, all that okay. He claims half a million are either, you know, incapable, or some of them have died. It's a large number. So according to this expert, it's about 23, 25 million people left in Ukraine, post the 5 million that are in the Russian occupation zones. Now, that is unsustainable for any country. And Ukraine has the lowest replacement rate in the world. How do you see what's happening in Ukraine? Are they just now without an option? Have they now left no other option but to fight? Uh, and because at the end of it, that's what the West wants from them. What do you see happening within Ukraine? Is there a change of mood amongst the people? I don't see those rallies with flags and people cheering on. I don't see that happening anymore. I don't see the crowds. I don't see the mothers in the cheering their sons into battle. Today, it's they're trying to protect them, hide them in basements. What's changed?
Well, first of all, we need to be very clear. The frustration that started after 2014 between Russia and Ukraine, it generated a lot of nationalistic patriotism on the part of Ukrainians. Even those Ukrainians who were neutral, they became extremely patriotic and pro Ukrainian. And simultaneously, they started becoming more and more anti Russian. So by the time the so called special operations were launched a year ago, Ukraine was largely anti Russian. Of course, it was strongly propagated by the ruling regime, saying things in the open that I am pro Russian or I like this or that about Russia were strongly forbidden, and people were simply afraid to say these kind of things in the open, though many of them were ethnic Russians. But those who decided to stay living in Ukraine, they took the side of Ukraine. uh, what they think about Russia and how they feel about Russia, it's a big, big question mark, because to get an honest answer from anybody nowadays, it's next to impossible. But negative feelings ranging with hatred to Russians because of the war hostilities, these feelings are on the right. In regard to war, people were very enthusiastic. They because the motivator was we're fighting for our motherland, and this motor is still strong. We need to defend our country from the Russian aggressor. Russians could be saying, oh, Ukraine is not a homogeneous country, Crimea is not Russian. But this is not what the better part of Ukrainians think. They say, look, we're a country whose borders are internationally recognized, and Crimea is internationally recognized as our territory. That's why we will fight for Crimea to be back again a part of Ukraine. And this is a very, very strong motivator for them. In regard to conscription, until recently, conscription was not very strong in western part of Ukraine because, as we talked last time, Ukraine is not a homogeneous country. The eastern or southeastern parts like Donbass or Lugansk, they're absolutely different from the so-called western parts of Ukraine that originally were parts of Poland and Hungary and Hungarian, Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, for some reason, the government did not touch the western parts, but nowadays, because casualties are so heavy and actually nobody knows for sure how high are the casualties, because the fighting is so ferocious nowadays. In the vicinity of Bakhmut alone, so many people are dying. Every day, hundreds of people are killed. The actual numbers vary because Ukrainians give one numbers and Russians totally different numbers. But judging by the ferocity of Ukrainian resistance, casualties are really, really high. That's why, in order to bring new conscripts, they now have to draft those living in Western Ukraine. And it generates a lot of negative feelings because one thing was in 2014 to yell and scream in favor of so called Maidan because Western regions were very much against Yanukovych and were the president of Ukraine disposed in 2014. So they were supporting Poroshenko, they were supporting Zelensky. But that was one thing. Another thing is that now many family men are drafted to the front or pushed into enlisting. to make the mothers, sisters, and wives and children very unhappy about it. So it's another source of discontent for Zelensky's policies. People say that there are many so-called volunteers fighting on Ukrainian side who came from different countries, largely from Poland. Then that frictions between the Ukrainian fighters and Polish fighters are really on the rise. There are all kind of fierce fighting going on there. But it doesn't mean that a conscription in Ukraine should be put on standby. It's on the rise because Zelensky needs more and more men to go to the front to fight.
What you brought about right now, especially with the Polish and the Ukrainian thing, is something which personally I was not aware of, and that's absolutely a very interesting development. Looking at the Polish designs on Western Ukraine, so I guess the word is spreading out. Uh, Coming towards the end of this interview, of course, I want to ask you about the West itself. Uh, we see Europe kind of, not having a voice of its own. I guess except for Hungary and Croatia, who've stood up and said, enough, we're not doing anymore. This is it. Uh, the rest of Europe is following the line of the United States, which brings me to the United States itself. There are voices within the US establishment, like the Rand Corporation put up a report saying these long wars should not be fought because US cannot afford it. There are other people coming out and saying today, we can't, we can't do this anymore. We need to sit down and have a settlement. We had the Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, putting out very, very strong statements. We had
Right.
a whole lot of people actually coming out and saying, now enough, this thing needs to stop. How do you see the development in the West, especially the US, with regards to the opposition to this war, which wasn't the case about 6 months ago?
Well, first of all, when the war started, the spirits were on the rise. Let the Russians try. Ukrainians will fight back, and the war would be over at the battlefield. But now people have started to realize, look, something needs to be done. This war should be stopped as soon as possible. So there should be a settlement reached. But I think the main idea the Americans pursue was to make Russia weak, not to kill Russia, because killing Russia it's not for Americans' benefit, but to make America mortal, to make Russia mortally wounded. This is what I would expect meeting American interests. Until Chancellor Merkel was in power, Europe was more or less on the peaceful route, so to say. At least she was one of those who was supporting the so called peaceful coexistence. I don't think she was a great admirer of Putin and his policies, but still, she knew that for the benefit of Western Europe, and for Germany particularly, it's better to have peace and good relationship with Russia. But with new government in office in Germany, the motto is on the rise that we should definitely push Ukraine and help Ukraine to fight against Russia. Russia is considered to be the absolute enemy of Germany. And this is what is voiced out loud for Baerbock, foreign minister of Germany. It's set in the open. I haven't heard these kind declarations for a long, long time. So I'm afraid it's a bit irresponsible. I'm afraid the current governments in Europe do not fully understand what they're doing because the situation that's been developing nowadays, it's not something that could be stopped in one day. Like, okay, now we stop fighting, we are in love with each other starting from tomorrow. No, it will take decades, maybe even a century, to come back to normal terms. And I'm afraid there are many people in Germany who do not realize that. On one hand, it's understandable because those who were reasonable minded, they were the people who fought at the fronts of the Second World War. For them, Stalingrad was not something vague, it was a real thing because many of them got wounded at the Stalingrad front. Many families suffered loss because their fathers or brothers got killed at the Stalingrad front. Now those who are in power in Western Europe, they read something in the textbooks. So for them, what the Second War was about is not that close to heart. So that's why for them it's much easier to accept the American position we should make Russia mortally wounded. And this is absolutely irresponsible. I agree with you that more and more people in the West have started saying, oh, this bizarre should be stopped. Even those who at the very start were saying bad things about Putin, blaming him for and open hostilities unleashed towards poor Ukrainian people who were fighting for their independence. Now the tone is often changed. Now even those people who were saying these kind of things a year ago, now they say, oh, this is just insane. It needs to be stopped. Well, I hope that the voice of reason prevails. I do hope.
It breaks my heart when I see stuff. And the problem is that when you speak a lie more than 10 times, I think somewhere down the line you start believing the lie itself. And uh,
Yeah, right.
I don't know what Zelensky's plan for the future is, because he's digging a hole for himself that I don't think he'll be able to crawl out of. Because, you know, I don't think Vladimir Putin is going to sit down in front of Zelensky once again and negotiate. So he has to really think what his own personal future is, because he can keep doing what he's doing, being the darling of the West, but for how long? My last question to you is about your prediction with regards to how far Europe itself would be able to drag this thing on. We see the terrible recognition of the European leaders. You mentioned Alenina Baerbock. I think she's one of the most. This is my opinion. You can fairly disagree with me on this. I think she's one of the most irresponsible politicians on the international arena. Uh, she's a foreign minister, and she said we are at war with Russia in an official European Parliament meeting. Now, the Russians can interpret that as a declaration of war, because that's how it is. She could have had a missile landing on her head the very next minute. The irresponsibleness of certain globalist neocon leaders is being tolerated to a large extent. How long do you think Europe as a people are going to tolerate this? Because we see protests in France, we see protests in Germany, we see protests in Netherlands, and even in Poland people are saying enough, stop this. So for my last question, how long will Europe last out?
Well, I think first of all, I totally agree with you that irresponsibility revealed on the part of the European leaders. It's the trend of our times, unfortunately. And sometimes I find it shocking because I remember the time of Jacques Chirac or Chancellor Merkel and Margaret Thatcher. They were different people, they were statesmen. And those who make declarations like Annalena Baerbock, well, they're not statesmen, they're not people who could be really the government leaders. This is a really sad thing to happen. And sometimes I ask myself a question: are there no really international leaders in the world left, or what? In regard to how long it'll go, I would expect that the West would take a so called wait and see position until spring, because there are many talks nowadays. Oh, Russians are advancing. Russians themselves, they are not so much optimistic about their advancing, but Americans, the so called office analysts, they started saying, oh, now a day Russians are advancing, and their advance would continue till June, and then things would start reverting in Ukrainian favor. And why till June? Because I think they expect the armor, the tanks, and APCs would arrive at Ukrainian front by June. But you never know what will happen within the next couple of months. If the Russian advance becomes really decisive, and if the victories they gain are really major, then maybe some reasonably minded people in the West, and primarily in America, would sit down and say, look, enough is enough. We need to start talking peace settlement. Of course, for this, at first, a ceasefire should be established, because after it's established, then you could start talking peace. A lot depends upon the contribution of the international leaders who are both on good terms with Russia and Ukraine. We know President Erdogan, who contributes continuous efforts to that. And also, you mentioned the name of ex Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett. It's something new, what he said a couple of days ago, that he was talking to Zelensky, and Zelensky was very paranoid. He was afraid about his life. And then Bennett talked to Putin, and Putin said, come on, I'm not going to touch him, I'm not going to kill him. And then Zelensky became very optimistic about his future. So I don't know how good are the how good would be the mediation on behalf of Israel, because the newly uh, elected Prime Minister Netanyahu is known for a very strong and productive relationship with President Putin. And also, I would expect him to be on strong terms with Zelensky. I'm not saying on friendly terms, because Prime Minister Netanyahu is not anybody's buddy. He's a shrewd politician. So, he could contribute a positive effort into this process. But these are my expectations. The West at large would, I think, sit and wait how the things on the battlefield develop. Of course, they can't say no to Zelensky when he pushes them so hard. Give me more money, give me tanks. I'm not sure that they would agree to give him jets if the Russian advance really started in a couple of months. If they realize that Russian advance is stable, I would expect them to say no to giving him jets. But anyway, a lot depends on the situation on the battlefield. Honestly, I don't think that Zelensky is in a position to win this war. And sooner or later, the war would be stopped, and the settlement would be fully or partially in Russian favor. Another thing is how long it'll take, how much casualty and damage it'll take. This is the most important thing.
Oh, absolutely, indeed. I don't think there is a doubt in anybody's mind except for a few who still buy the narrative of Ukrainian victory, because I mean, to my mind, and I'm not a military expert or anything, it's impossible. I mean, the Russians have barely taken a scratch in their country, and the other one is completely destroyed. I mean, there's no sense of industry, agriculture, electricity, train networks, people, nothing left. How can you win a war when you have pretty much you're destroyed? So it's it's like England declaring victory on Germany in the Second World War. Fair enough, they were on the winning side, but their own country was there was nothing left. So it was a vassal state of the US who kind of fed on it and paid off their loans in 2016. So about 70 years after the finish of the Second World War. So it's a terrible situation. But the problem is, and you brought it out very interestingly, is that Zelensky today is in a position of no return. I think he can't stop it and say, okay, I'm done, because he'll get beaten up and probably killed within his own country. He can't run from there. So the only other option is to fight. I don't think these Ukrainians have any other options anymore.
Well, you're absolutely correct because Zelensky is now in a trap. I think he got such a major Western support not for nothing. Apparently, some under the table, there were promises made. So for him to say, okay, I've taken so much armor from you, I've taken so much funds from you, but sorry, I failed, I stopped. He's not in a position to do this. And not because he would be afraid for his personal safety, if not to say life, but because there are certain other, maybe in person obligation he bears before the Western community. So the only way for him is to continue fighting until the Western side, the United States and Western Europe decide that it's enough and fighting should be stopped. The first precursor would be a no more weaponry to Ukraine. If this decision is taken, then it would be beginning of a process for slowly but surely to take the parts of some kind of sophisticated settlement of this conflict. There are ways to settle this conflict, but the longer it goes, the more sophisticated this process would be. If at the very beginning it was quite easy, remember, the peace talks started already in March, but they were very unproductive and it, they were not impressive. I don't think they could have resulted in anything meaningful, but at least this process did have grounds in March. But nowadays, the situation is different. Such an easy way to come to peace settlement is not possible anymore. And what is even still worse, it's not possible without international mediation, about involving some third parties into this process, because too many actors are involved these days. And we're not talking about the situation at the battlefield only. We're now talking about economy as well, because of these sanctions imposed on Russia and about the repercussions of these sanctions. So it's just combination of things.
Maria, as usual, I think you've been so clear in your thought process and how you've described the situation. I guess that's one of the reasons why I like connecting with you and talking to you about this particular, situation in Ukraine and, of course, in Europe. You brought about with immense clarity the points on the ground, and I appreciate that. In spite of the country that you're in going through complete turmoil, you've taken out the time for me to sit down and talk. I'm thankful, and I hope you stay safe. And keep take care of yourself. It's hard times, especially in Turkey right now. Please do take care of yourselves, and thank you so much for these views. And I look forward once again to connect with you in some time for another update, and of course your clear views. Till then, thank you.
Thank you very much, Adi, for saying all these nice words. And thank you very much for all the best that you wish to me at this dramatic time in Turkey. Keeping in touch. Have a very good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.